Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something pretty complex, definitely one of the big public health questions of our time, digital tech and the mental well-being of kids and teenagers. And our goal here really is to get past just counting screen time hours. You hear that metric all the time, but we want to look deeper at what researchers are now calling digital overattachment. And just to give you a sense of the scale here, there's this finding, right, from the National Health Interview Survey. Between 2021 and 2023, roughly half, that's 50.4% of U.S. teens said they spent 4 or more hours every day on screens for stuff not related to schoolwork. I mean, half of them, 4 hours plus daily. That feels like, well, that feels like the whole story right there, doesn't it?
Yeah. Definitely the headline, but yeah, not quite the whole story. That massive number is actually why the research focus is shifting. We're realizing, just measuring the duration, the raw hours, it's not enough. The big change is looking more at the quality of that use, how it functions in their lives. That's where terms like problematic usage of the internet, or PUI, come in, and also this idea of smartphone attachment. PUI fundamentally is all about the negative impact. It means the internet use is causing real problems, psychological, social, maybe impacting school or work. The time spent is almost secondary to the functional impairment it creates.
Okay, PUI, let's unpack that a bit. It sounds like it covers a whole range of sort of addiction-like digital behaviors, not just one thing. I know the European network, UPUI, they came up with 8 categories. What kind of things are we talking about?
Exactly. They wanted to get more specific than just internet addiction. I mean, we know the obvious ones, right? Like
Right.
gaming disorder or problematic social media use. But they went broader. So they included things like cyberchondria, that compulsive need to look up illness symptoms online, which then fuels health anxiety.
Ah, right. I think we all know someone who does that. Or maybe do it ourselves sometimes.
We probably do. And then there's something called digital hoarding. This is like excessively collecting digital stuff, files, photos, you name it. Not just having lots of photos, but spending ages organizing them, worrying about losing them, to the point where it actually cuts into sleep or seeing friends.
Wow, okay. So it's really about use that causes measurable disruption. That distinction is super helpful. It's behavior that gets in the way of life. But let's talk about that other term you mentioned, attachment. Why is thinking about emotional dependency or attachment to the phone itself maybe more useful than just counting the hours?
Well, because attachment gets at that feeling of dependency, right?
Yeah.
The emotional need, the role the phone plays in how someone regulates their own feelings. Those are really key signs of vulnerability. If you literally feel like you can't put the phone down, that points to something deeper than just habit.
Or reliance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There was this one big study that measured smartphone attachment specifically using a tool called the MPIQ on adolescents. And the results were pretty stark. Kids who scored above the threshold for moderate to severe attachment, they reported significantly higher anxiety scores on standardized tests. We're talking 52.9 versus 46.3 for those below the threshold.
Wow, okay, a 5-point jump on a standardized anxiety score. That's not trivial. Are they saying the attachment causes the anxiety, or is it just a strong link for now?
For now, it's mainly correlation, but it's a very strong one.
Yeah.
And we saw almost the exact same pattern with depression scores, 51.4 for the high attachment group versus 46.3 for the lower. It really suggests that relying heavily on the device emotionally is tightly linked with that internal distress, like anxiety and depression. And interestingly, girls tended to score higher on attachment than boys, 30.5 versus 27.2, which kind of lines up with other findings around social media.
And this is all happening during adolescence, which we know is already a tricky time developmentally. Their brains are still under construction. Why is the teenage brain particularly vulnerable here?
Yeah, it really comes down to that ongoing brain development. The prefrontal cortex, that's the bit responsible for things like impulse control, making sensible decisions, understanding social cues, managing emotions. It's still maturing, still wiring itself up.
So the brakes aren't fully developed yet?
Pretty much. Their internal brakes aren't fully online, so they tend to seek out novelty and sensation, especially when peers are involved. This just makes them naturally more susceptible to the risks online and potentially to those sort of addictive loops you can get into with problematic use.
Okay, so high screen use can kind of amplify existing vulnerabilities. And the costs aren't just mental, right? The data shows it pushes out healthy habits too. What did the NHIS teen data say about the immediate health stuff reported by teens spending 4+ hours a day on screens?
Oh yeah, the displacement effect is really clear, especially with the basics. sleep, and physical activity. High screen users were about 1.5 times more likely, 1.45 to be exact, to say they weren't often well rested,
Makes sense.
and 1.58 times more likely to have an irregular sleep routine. We know screens push back bedtimes, the light messes with sleep signals,
Right.
and they were also 1.42 times more likely to report concerns about their weight. Importantly, this wasn't about their actual weight or BMI, just their worry about it, being too high or too low. So you see this direct link between lots of screen time and disruption to really fundamental health behaviors.
Okay, let's zero in on the mental health symptoms themselves, because some of these numbers are pretty striking. Even when researchers adjusted for things like family income, background, education, what were the odds for anxiety and depression?
Yeah, those adjusted numbers are key because they try to isolate the screen use factor, controlling for other things that could be playing a role. And what they found was teens with that high daily screen time were 2.51 times more likely to report symptoms of depression.
2.5 times.
Yeah, and 2.12 times more likely to report anxiety symptoms in the past couple of weeks compared to kids with lower screen time.
For someone listening who isn't, deep in the research weeds, what does 2.51 times more likely actually mean in practical terms? Is it saying screens definitely cause depression, or is it just the strongest link we see?
It means that even when you account for many of the usual suspects, poverty, family issues, maybe pre-existing conditions, this high volume of screen time still stands out as a major risk factor.
Yeah.
It's showing a really powerful relationship. Establishing direct one-way causation is always the tricky part in this kind of research, but the correlation is incredibly strong.
We also have to touch on the really serious links with self-harm and suicide risk. What did the sources show there? The connection between problematic use, maybe cyberbullying, and self-injury.
There's definitely evidence of an association there. It seems particularly strong when you have problematic internet use combined with social media use and cyberbullying. Exposure through screens, seeing images of self-harm, sharing them, comparing that's flagged as a potential risk factor.
And that risk goes up quite a bit if a young person is dealing with both cyberbullying and shows signs of PUI.
Exactly. The combination seems particularly potent.
But I know this area is complex. Is there a counterargument? Do these online spaces ever offer any kind of protection or help?
Yes, it's definitely nuanced. Some research does point to potential protective effects. For certain teens, especially those who feel marginalized offline, online communities can offer emotional support. They might help with self-regulation or even be a way to find help or connect with others going through similar things.
Okay.
But we have to be careful not to assume causality there either. Is the online support genuinely beneficial, or is it just filling a gap because real-world support is lacking? It's hard to untangle.
Right. Let's shift to another area where screens, especially visual media, seem to have a big impact: body image and disordered eating.
Yeah, the research there is pretty consistent. Exposure to highly visual content, especially on social media platforms, seems to really ramp up the pressure around physical appearance.
Yeah.
The constant curating and editing of photos.
Mm.
There's a strong link between high engagement with that kind of visual content and developing negative body image or disordered eating patterns.
Is there long-term data on that?
Actually, yes. The ABCD study, Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development, provided some really compelling longitudinal evidence. They followed kids over time and found that the risk of eating disorder symptoms, things like being afraid of gaining weight or engaging in compensatory behaviors, actually increased with each extra hour spent on screens or social media. And it seems tied to specific online behaviors like constantly comparing yourself to others online or consuming a lot of content about diets, weight loss, and body image.
Okay, so we've got potential impacts on sleep, anxiety, body image. When kids present with problems related to screen use, is it usually just one thing, or are these issues often tangled together?
That's a really important point. That large Chinese study looking at kids from 6 to 16, they found that co-occurrence, having two or more psychological or behavioral problems at the same time, was actually more common than just having one single issue.
So problems tend to travel in packs.
Exactly. They rarely show up in isolation.
Did they see any patterns in which problems tended to cluster together?
Yes. Compulsive behavior was pretty high across the board for all ages and sexes. But interestingly, for adolescent girls, say 12 to 16 years old, the co-occurring issues often included things like schizoid-like behavior, maybe appearing immature for their age, and even cruelty. Yeah, it really highlights why clinicians need to look at the whole picture, do a really broad assessment. Just treating one symptom of problematic internet use might not address the bigger pattern.
Okay, so beyond those specific behavioral issues, can we quickly recap the other costs? Physical and maybe cognitive ones?
Sure. Well, physically, high screen use is almost always sedentary use, right? So it
Hmm.
directly pushes out time for physical activity. It's clearly linked to less overall movement and less strength training.
Right.
Cognitively, this kind of intense, often rapidly shifting screen use is known to make existing attention difficulties worse.
And what about really early exposure, like toddlers and screens?
There are associations there too. One study found that kids who started using screens earlier, especially before age 2, had a higher risk of developing ADHD symptoms later on compared to kids whose first exposure was later. It suggests that maybe that early exposure interferes with brain development during really critical periods.
Okay. And what about kids who already have a diagnosis like ADHD or autism spectrum disorder? Does problematic internet use hit them harder? Does it worsen their existing challenges?
Yes, significantly harder. For kids with ADHD, PUI tends to be more severe than in their peers without ADHD. And it makes their core symptoms worse, the inattention, the impulsivity, the hyperactivity. And for children with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, excessive screen time seems to exacerbate repetitive behaviors and can lead to even less social interaction, which is already a challenge.
Is there a theory why?
One leading hypothesis is that all that screen time might actually inhibit the development of key social neural circuits during critical windows. Those circuits are really important for navigating social interactions, which is often a core difficulty for individuals with ASD and even ADHD.
So, okay, we've got these undeniable links between high usage, this idea of attachment, and some pretty serious health outcomes. But you mentioned the causality debate is still, well, debated. If the impact really varies so much by individual and context, where should we be focusing our efforts?
Yeah, we have to keep coming back to that complexity. While reviews find these negative links, many of the effects, statistically speaking, are described as negative but very small.
Small effect sizes.
Right. Which leads some researchers to really question the direction. Are the screens causing the depression or anxiety? Or are young people who are already depressed, anxious, or socially isolated turning to screens more, maybe as a coping mechanism, however effective or ineffective?
So the chicken or the egg problem.
Exactly. The ultimate impact seems to really depend on the individual kid, their own biology, their history, what they're actually doing online, the content, and the situation they're using it in, the context.
And we also need to remember, as you touched on, that for many kids, digital tools offer real benefits, real protective factors even.
Absolutely essential to remember that. The pandemic really drove that home, didn't it? Digital media became a lifeline. Things like one-on-one chats, really opening up to friends online, finding funny content, those things can genuinely help reduce loneliness and stress. And it's particularly crucial for young people from underrepresented groups, say transgender or non-binary youth, who often find community, belonging, and vital support online that they might not find easily offline.
So, given all this complexity, what does it mean for parents? They hear all this, they're worried. What are the practical takeaways? We know the American Academy of Pediatrics kind of moved away from those strict time limits, like the old no screens before 2 rule.
That's right. The AAP shifted away from rigid hour counts towards a more tailored approach. They advocate for creating a family media plan.
Okay, what does that involve?
It's about focusing on balance,
Yeah.
setting clear boundaries that work for your family, maybe no screens in bedrooms, or keeping mealtime screen-free. And crucially, having ongoing open conversations with your kids about how they're using screens and how it makes them feel. It's more about mindful use than just minutes.
But then you see things like the Canadian guideline, which still suggests 2 hours or less of recreational screen time is linked to better mental health, kids being happier, less stressed. Is the AAP's flexible approach maybe letting parents off the hook instead of giving them concrete limits that might actually work?
That really is the crux of the policy debate, isn't it? Finding that balance. However, the research on family dynamics does give us some pretty solid clues about what helps, regardless of the specific rule structure. For instance, that Chinese study found maternal education having a bachelor's degree or higher was protective against kids having multiple co-occurring problems. This might be linked to resources, health, literacy, who knows?
Yeah. But maybe more universally applicable. Higher levels of parent-child conflict and less parent-child interaction time were definite risk factors for those co-occurring problems. So whether you go for strict limits or a flexible plan, the key seems to be active parental engagement, keeping communication lines open and trying to reduce conflict around the issue. Those are the protective factors. #outro. So I think the core takeaway here is that the challenge for families, for society, has really shifted. It's less about just counting the minutes and hours and more about understanding and managing this concept of attachment and ensuring that whatever time is spent on screens doesn't push out those absolutely critical things for developing brain and body, getting enough sleep, getting enough physical activity, and having real face-to-face social connections.
Right. Which leads to maybe a final thought, something provocative for listeners to consider that researchers themselves are grappling with. We see these strong links, high screen use, tied to anxiety, depression, self-harm. But is there a risk that we focus so much public attention, so much policy energy on the device, the phone, the app, that we get distracted? Distracted from tackling other huge, maybe harder to fix things contributing to the youth mental health crisis, like poverty, inequality, violence in communities, or just plain old systemic isolation? That's a big question we need to confront as technology weaves itself ever deeper into young lives. This has been The Deep Dive.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Decode. I really appreciate you joining me today. If something we talked about sparked your interest, or if there's a medical term that's been bugging you, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this, be a pal and share it with a friend. We'll catch you on the next one.